Hello, Between the Chapters Book Club. Admin LJ here, once again with one of our really exciting author Q&As. You guys know, you've heard it 1,000 times. I always love getting to do these chats with you. I love getting the chance to talk with our authors about their books, getting to talk to you guys about their books. So this is always a really fun part of my job. It makes me really happy to do them. So thank you for always tuning in and coming to hang out with us. It just makes it so much more fun when you guys are here hanging out with everyone. As always, if you have questions or if you want to answer some of the questions we're posing during our conversation, please drop it in the comments section. I will be hanging out down there with you. I always love hearing from you guys, so please join me down there. During our half-hour broadcast, if you ask a question to our special guest, you will be entered to win a flash giveaway. We're actually going to give away a copy of the White Allies Handbook. Keep an eye out for this one because there is going to be some fun stuff coming up for that book as well down the line. So if you want an early copy, come join us for the chat. Leave a question. Anyways, I'm going to jump right into it. Tonight, we're being joined by Valena Beety. She is the author of Manifesting Justice. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. You guys don't know this about me, but I actually went to school for justice-related major, and I was very involved in social justice work and justice reform. So this conversation is one that I've really been looking forward to. It means a lot to me, and I can't wait to facilitate this. So I'm going to quit yammering on. You're not here to talk to me. You're here to talk to our special guest. So I'm going to bring her on screen now, and we will get started. Remember to come chat with us down in the comment section. Hi, Valena. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, so excited to be here and to learn about your own background in justice work.
I know it always shocks people. No one really knows it about me. I don't talk about it a lot anymore because it's been a number of years since I was in school, but it is something I was very passionate about. So I was super excited when I first learned about this book, and then even more excited when it finally came out and I could talk to people about it. So I'm really happy. I would love it if you could introduce yourself and talk about the book a little bit with readers who may not have heard about it or may not have gotten a chance to pick it up yet.
Yeah, so I'm Valena. I teach at Arizona State. I'm an innocence litigator, which means I represent people who have been wrongfully convicted in our criminal legal system. And before I became an innocence litigator, I was a federal prosecutor. And a big thing that Manifesting Justice weighs is, how do we serve victims? How do we respect victims and provide solutions that help them, while also making sure that we don't have people who are wrongfully convicted, that we have a criminal legal system that is more just. Mm-hmm. And I explore how we do that through looking at these three women, Lee, Tammy, and Kim. And they're three friends, and they meet at a drug rehab facility in Mississippi. And they leave that facility, and Kim overdoses. So Lee and Tammy, her friends, call 911, call for help. She's taken to the hospital. They're worried about her. And a doctor there says, it looks like there's been an aggressive sexual encounter here. And at that point, things just spiral out of control because Lee and Tammy are lesbians. And so the doctor and then the police and then the prosecutor believe that because they are lesbians, they've assaulted their friend, Kim. So that is our background to this story.
Mm-hmm. I find it really interesting that your background, really led you to this place where you were able to write this book. Before we delve into all of that and kind of talk about what your background and how your background shaped what you wrote and what you were doing, I would love to know, what does manifesting justice mean? What does it mean to you, and what does it mean in relation to the book?
Yeah. So I'm a lawyer, and the title comes from a legal claim called miscarriage of justice or manifest injustice. And it's where we look at whether the system failed. Like, we look at whether there were police officers who didn't testify truthfully on the stand, or if there was false scientific evidence or expert evidence presented, or if prosecutors didn't turn over the evidence that showed the defendants were actually innocent. So looking at if there was a miscarriage of justice in the system. And I have represented women, represented queer people who have been wrongfully convicted. And this idea is really important to me because women and queer people often don't have like DNA evidence, that golden ticket that can, 100% show it definitely wasn't them. So for me, it's important to look at, was there a miscarriage of justice here? Was this conviction something we continue to think is valid and upheld? Like, let's look at our system itself.
Do you ever find yourself, I would imagine that it would get really hard to examine that big of a scope,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to, like you said, there are so many ways that injustices can happen, and it's not always intentional.
Oh, yeah.
There are a lot of times when it definitely is, but there are so many times when there are these inherent prejudices that lead to injustices that people just aren't even aware of anymore. So I'm curious, how do you push through that? Does it ever, start to kind of weigh on you that this is such a huge umbrella that it takes a huge fight to get through?
And I think that's it. I think it's recognizing that it takes so many more people than just one person, and we can each play a role. And we may think that what we're doing is small. We may think that calling our legislator is a small thing, or voting in a referendum is a small thing. But it really takes so many of us to be able to create change. And one thing I do is I write. I mean, I loved writing this book, and I tried to cover so many different things. What can we do around prosecutors? What can we do around victims and respecting victims? So I hope that the book really can, readers can even follow the storyline, but then pick and choose, like, oh, I really want to know more about prosecutors. I really want to know more about like bite mark evidence. And all these different chapters, because they're all pieces that can come together to make our system more just.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you said that you often find yourself wanting to know more about certain areas. Like you mentioned the bite mark evidence, that's one of those things that you hear on true crime shows, or if you follow any legal proceedings, there are sometimes things introduced that you think they could use that, they can talk about, like it's mind-boggling at times. So I have you ever found yourself kind of falling down, a rabbit hole of sorts of, this is a thing now? Where does it come from? How do we approach it?
Absolutely. I mean, I held back in this book from going
Right.
down my entire deep dive on bite mark evidence,
Yeah.
but it's crazy. I mean, and if you even like bite mark experts themselves, they've done their own internal testing to see, okay, how reliable are we? And the very first question is this mark, in their testing, is this mark a bite mark?
Right.
And they can't all agree on that. And then the next question is it a human bite mark or is it an animal bite mark? And they can't agree on that. And so you finally get to, okay, it is a human bite mark. Can we match it to a dental mold? And listen, a lot of these bite marks are just like a red blob. So my dental mold could match it. Your dental mold could match it. And you just have to wonder, like, this is what we're relying on.
Right.
So there's so many different types of science, like blood spatter or shoe prints. And these arose out of policing and police investigation instead of out of like a lab that's testing them and hypotheses. So there's a lot of value to them, but we have to know the limits to the value. I mean, they're usually better at excluding people, like saying, okay, here's a shoe print. It's a size 7. that means that Valena with her size 10 shoes, like, isn't going to match. But
Mm-hmm.
it's not as good at saying, oh, it's a size 7. Lauren wears a size 7. It's her.
Right. Right.
So it's an interesting thing to talk about.
It is. Not to get us totally off track, but I just say I took like one semester of forensic sciences, and it was just mind-boggling, and I thought that's what I would do in life until I took the class and realized that it's just so much. There's so much out there. It's truly overwhelming.
Yeah.
So
And
I could see how you would get lost in it.
yeah, and I have friends who are like shoe print experts, right? And who
Right.
like work for crime labs and do this kind of work. And there is value to these different areas, but we just have to recognize like there's a limit to it. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, my book is about wrongful convictions and how people are wrongfully convicted because the evidence was just false.
Right. Well, speaking of, these wrongful convictions and the cases that you've studied, you, like I said, you do have an extensive background, both in the legal world, in in Innocence Projects, you are enmeshed in these cases, and especially in this book, you mention a number of cases, not just the main one you talked about at the start of our chat. Were there any cases either mentioned in the book or in your work life that really kind of changed your worldview and just were kind of eye-opening and stand out to you as one that you can't forget?
Yeah,
I'm sure there's a lot.
I'm going to give 2 answers.
Yeah.
And one is that I have a chapter here that is specifically about women who are currently incarcerated in this one prison in Mississippi. And I have a current client there, Tasha Shelby, and she's our guide through that prison and her own experience and of these other women. So I just think that's so important to be able to provide a space for these women to share their stories as well.
Right.
So that was key to the book. But a case that really changed my life, who's in there, is Levon Brooks, who is a man in Mississippi who was wrongfully convicted. And I came down to Mississippi. I was a prosecutor in DC. I came down to interview for this job with the Mississippi Innocence Project. I didn't know whether I was going to up and move to Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
And the director said, well, why don't you come and meet this one of our exonerees, Levon. So we drove to a rural part of Mississippi, and we actually went to Levon's mother's funeral, which is just crazy. But what was even more crazy was how welcoming Levon and his family were to me, to all of us. It demonstrated first that innocence litigators really become very close with their clients and with their clients' families, and they're very trusted. But second, that they were willing to be that open to me and talk with me. And that Levon, when I was like, how tragic that you just got out of prison and your mom has been fighting for you for 20 years and now she's passed away. And he had so much grace. And he said she was able to put her hammer down. She fought for me. She was able to see me free. That's what matters. And that humanity and that grace, that changed my whole life. And that's how I ended up moving to Mississippi.
Yeah, I can imagine that even just hearing that story, like, really kind of takes your breath away and makes you kind of step back for a moment to think about the implications of every part of the justice system and every part of what it means to go through the justice system and how it can kind of ripple affect everything around you. So I can imagine, I can understand how that would be a truly life-altering experience. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah. And one thing that, so Tammy, who's one of the women, one of the things that she says near the end of the book is about how family members of incarcerated people do the time too.
Right.
And just recognizing those family members and how much they do. And in this book, I talk about the mamas. I talk about the mamas who support all of these 3 women and how powerful and forceful they are. And they won't be silenced. They keep fighting. So I think that's an important part.
It's definitely an important part. I will say I I'm an easily emotional person. So every time a mama came on page or, you know, anyone mentioned the mom component, it was almost instant waterworks for me
Yeah.
because that's just, it's a lot. And the idea and the emotions of what they have to go through, it, you know, it is very true. You know, your family goes through it with you, and that's heartbreaking. So I am glad that you do give that, you know, you show that and you show how it you know, it does expand. It's not just the one person who's impacted.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And the family of victims, you know, to the
mm-hmm.
extent we provide space for victims to actually talk about what's happened to them,
Right.
which I wish we would do more of, you know, that
Mm-hmm.
we allow people to share that experience and not feel shame about it.
Right.
Family is so important, and mothers are always so important.
Absolutely. Well, before I start crying and like
I
mess up my
know.
makeup totally, I'm going to move us on to the next question because I will start crying on camera and it's not a pretty look for me. Um, but moving on, I was really curious because a huge part of this book, like you say, you know, this initial case that you really kind of circled the book around does feature a lesbian couple. You know, it is women who are very intrinsically, you know, prejudiced against and are very much worked against in every system, you know, just kind of across society in general. And one of the things that was really impactful throughout the book was the intersectionality component. You know, it's not just women, it's queer women, it's Black women, women of color. It is, you know, all these disenfranchised groups, the LGBT community in general, you know, just across the board, how that intersectionality kind of impacts everything. So I was curious, you know, to you, what does that intersectionality look like when it comes to our justice system, you know, and the injustices that are often faced by those communities?
So our justice system doesn't always provide, you know, I was just talking about providing space. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
always provide space to really reckon with racism, sexism, homophobia.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to write about this in part because I am a queer woman. I am cisgendered, married to another cisgendered woman. Uh, and I just saw this story was not coming out. And
Mm-hmm.
again, it goes back to this idea of shame and how harmful shame can be and can really suppress our stories. And the whole book begins with a quote about sharing our stories. The quickest way to connect with someone is to share your story. And that I hope we can listen to each other and listen to these complex stories. And it does become complex when we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about, you know, being a Black queer woman, for example. Um, and our justice system can handle those complex stories. We don't always have to just see someone as one dimensional. When we only see people as one dimensional, that's when our identities can be weaponized against us. So that's when
Mm-hmm.
we start to have stereotypes around race, stereotypes around gender, around sexual orientation, that then can be used against people in the courtroom. Um, so I hope this book really promotes that we can be visible, we should be visible, and our system can acknowledge the fullness and wholeness of people.
Absolutely. You know, I'm curious, you know, also as a queer woman, it's, you know, that's a lot of this book really resonated to me. You know, I am clearly a white queer woman, so I do not come up against all of the pitfalls and the firewalls that many other people do. And so it was interesting to me to see all the areas that I didn't know and that I wasn't cognizant, I wasn't aware of, even within a community that I am a part of. So it really got me thinking about how we tell these stories and how we, you know, share them with other people. How is, you know, like you said, you are a queer woman yourself, you know, you are retelling these stories and sharing these stories of these individuals. How has that lens impacted you? You know, what does it mean to you to get to tell those stories and get to be a voice for them?
It's huge. And that's, you know, that's why I have one chapter that's specifically about queer people who are criminalized, one chapter about transgender individuals, one chapter about, the women who are in this specific prison. It's really important that there is space for all of these stories and for these to be shared, because when they're not shared, and particularly in the legal system, when they're not shared, then that encourages passing, suppressing our identities. I mean, within the queer community, it can be easier to pass and there can be pressure to pass that might not be the same with gender and race.
Right.
But that passing can be really harmful to the individual person and your sense of self, but also if there are never diverse people seen or recognized in the courtroom, it becomes easier for these stereotypes to take hold. So in this, in this book, just some of the testimony, and this is testimony by experts. So this is who a jury is listening to. And so you have an expert who says, I would expect to find bite marks in a homosexual rape case. You have another expert who is saying homosexual crimes are sadistic. Homosexuals to homosexuals do tremendous damage. They're gory. They're repulsive. And there's nothing to back this up or to validate it. But when there's no visibility in the courtroom, then it becomes easier for a jury to say, well, this is an expert. This is what they're saying. So based on the evidence that has been shown me, yeah, I'm going to find this person guilty.
Right. Do you have, I know through your work, you do have a lot of ideas and a lot of things that you believe in for people to actually get involved and participate in ways that we can start making these changes. I would love if you could talk a little bit about some of those ideas, with readers who may really just be considering all of this for kind of the first time.
Yeah. So I, even if people just see the book in a bookstore, in the very back, it has a checklist of tools for manifesting justice. And it talks about different things that we can do as just individuals to make a difference in our criminal legal system, make a difference in terms of drugs and drug reform, make a difference in terms of how victims are treated. So prosecutors, I was a prosecutor. Prosecutors have a tremendous amount of power. And guess what? We get to elect the head prosecutors. And each county we're in usually has their own prosecutor, and we get to elect them. So it's really important for those elected people to know, here's what I prioritize. Here, I'm a community member. I care about how you're treating victims. I'm a community member. I care about how you're responding to drug offenses. I care about whether you have a conviction integrity unit that looks at whether there was a wrongful conviction or not. And I think the same is true with our legislators and legislation going through. And I just think about the legislation in Florida about, there's been a bunch of it, but about not being able to take children to a drag show. And I think of drag queens who read at bookstores, do like a children's hour and read children's books to kids. And I feel like we're missing the people and the humanity when we have laws like that.
Right. It's so easy to other or create monsters out of people that we don't get to see and that we don't get to interact and be around. So it just becomes this cycle of, well, you've never been around, drag queens or at a drag show. So to you, it is uncomfortable. It is scary. You don't know what's happening. So to not expose ourselves to these other communities and be around people that we're not around 24/7, it just creates that cycle, like you said earlier, of, well, if all we're hearing are the worst things, it's easy to believe the worst things. So yeah, I love that your book has that checklist. I love that, there are all these ways that people can get involved at every level. You don't have to go out and go to protests or anything like that, but you can just start getting informed and getting involved. And I like that this book has, all of that covered from, top to bottom. So I wanted to make sure we got a chance to talk about that. Um, One other thing I did really want to make sure we touched on is in the book, you do mention practicing restorative justice and what restorative justice means for our system. It's not necessarily that we need to tear the system apart. I think a lot of people get very nervous talking about justice reform, thinking, well, we're just going to tear it apart, take it down to the stubs. That's not necessarily the case. So I would love if you could, talk a little bit about what restorative justice means and what it means for our system and how we can approach it.
Yeah, thanks. So I became a prosecutor because I had been a rape victim advocate and I really cared about stopping cycles of violence. And I thought that if I could prosecute and incarcerate people who are causing these harms, that would be the solution. And it turned out it's one solution, but it doesn't always help victims. It doesn't always mean that someone goes to prison even.
Right.
Or that they go to prison for very long. So our system has to think of what are some other ways to serve and to protect victims, to stop cycles of violence, in addition to incarceration. Incarceration is one tool, but there are other tools. And when we think about other possibilities, that's called restorative justice. So if we're thinking about drug crimes and how we used to sentence people for crack cocaine to 100 years in prison for possession. And now there's more, if it's possession and we're talking about someone has an addiction, well, maybe we should get at the root of that addiction to overcome that addiction. And does prison do that? So restorative justice is simply expanding what our tools are to try to stop cycles of violence, help victims, and hopefully, help people who have committed offenses become their best selves and stop those actions.
Right. Perfect. Thank you for, walking us through that, telling us a little bit more about that. I really appreciate, I appreciate all of the outside the box options because, like you said, incarceration is not the only tool we have. It's just the one we go to first. And there's a lot of reasons behind that, more reasons than we can get into on a 30-minute live stream, but it's always great to look outside that box. We have just a couple minutes left, so I want to make sure to take a little bit of time to talk about, you are the founding director of the Innocence Project in West Virginia. So I would love it if you could talk to us a little bit about, not only being the founding director, but a little bit about what the Innocence Project is.
Yes. I worked at the Mississippi Innocence Project as a staff attorney. I moved to West Virginia and I started the West Virginia Innocence Project. The current director is Melissa Giggenbach. For anyone who's in West Virginia, she's amazing. But it was an opportunity for me to start this project, this nonprofit, to investigate if people are wrongfully convicted. So that means talking to people in prisons. That means talking to judges, talking to defense attorneys and prosecutors who honestly will come to Innocence Projects and say, I had this case. It never sat well with me. Will you look into it? And it's doing all that investigative work to find out, well, what did happen here? Is there DNA evidence that actually shows someone else was the true perpetrator? Because whenever there's a wrongful conviction, that usually means that the true perpetrator is still out, is still free. So there's a double importance to solving wrongful convictions. And that's what Innocence Work does. And briefly, there's the Innocence Project in New York, which is a large project. And then there's an Innocence Network of all of the state Innocence Projects. And your state probably has an Innocence Project too.
Right, absolutely. That's really a really important distinction because I know for me, like I definitely say, oh, Innocence Project, like I've heard of that. I know it in tangential terms. And then I didn't realize until, the first time I heard about your book when it was presented to me by the editor, I was like, oh, each state also has one. So it was definitely eye-opening to me. So I'm glad we make that distinction too. So it's very important, you know, state level is just as important as countrywide. So, and
Yeah,
in some
definitely.
states, maybe even a little more important, a little more fighting and hard work needing to go on. So definitely crucial work. Um, Thank you so much for talking with us about that, with us about the book in general. We are at the end of our half hour. So before we officially say goodbye, where can readers find you online if they want to follow you or learn more about your work or just kind of keep up with what you're doing?
Yeah, so my name's a bit tricky. It's Valena Beety, Valena Beety. But once you have my name down, you can find me. So I have a webpage, valenabeety.com. I'm on Twitter at Valena Beety.
Mhm.
I'm on Instagram at Valena Beety, Facebook at Valena Beety. So once you get my name down
Right.
and the spelling, you can find me. And please, please be in touch.
Yeah, definitely, especially on Twitter and Instagram. Like I mean, obviously I follow you for work, but I also follow you on my personal stuff because your platforms are really fun. So definitely go check her out online, keep up to date with what she's working on. And thank you so much, Valena. This was a really amazing conversation. I'm so glad I got to sit with you and chat with you, not only about your book, but about your work and what drives you forward. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us this evening.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone out there. It's just great to be part of this conversation.
Yeah. So thank you and good night to all of our readers. And just as a quick aside, readers, be sure to join me again tomorrow night at 5:30 p.m. Eastern, where we're doing our special Pride Live Q&A. We have 3 guest authors. I'm really stoked. So I hope to see you there as well. But good night, everyone.